arrest, evidence of everything being related to drug use, that the defense is doing a full-on trial of George Floyd, who's not on trial, but that is what they're doing. And well, that's our point of view, Your Honor. And so if the court were to rule that the defense, that neither side is allowed to characterize Mr. Floyd's behaviors, that we don't get to bring in a Dr. Vincent to say that the behaviors are reflective of anxiety or panic attack. On the other hand, the prosecution doesn't get to accuse him of resisting arrest.
Well, here's the other part. It's not mutually exclusive that someone is in a mental health crisis and is also resisting arrest. Would you agree with that?
Well, Your Honor, not without the use of expert testimony in that regard, because...
Oh, let's go into a more hypothetical. Someone is having a mental health crisis. They are removed from this case completely, and they start to thrash about and refuse to get handcuffed. An intentional act, refusing to be handcuffed, refusing to whatever, it may be due. Their behavior may have been induced by a mental health crisis, but it's still resisting arrest. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Well, I would agree that it's non-compliant, and the difference we're having, Your Honor, is definitional. When I conceive of resisting arrest, it suggests that there is an intention, that the person is able to form an intention and is in fact acting on the intention to resist arrest, as opposed to simply non-compliant. The police policies and procedures speak in terms of non-compliant behavior, and that then the police have to make an assessment as to whether the non-compliance is resisting arrest as opposed to an inability to comply.
Because of the policy?
By the policy and the training.
Okay.
And so there's a difference, but to Your Honor's initial question, essentially, is it not fair to allow in the May 2019, if we're allowed to have Dr. Vinson then put in testimony about George Floyd's behaviors? Our testimony with respect to Dr. Vinson in that regard is rebuttal testimony in nature. It is rebutting the assertion from the defendants that George Floyd's behavior can only mean one thing, and it's the things that the defense has asserted. We think that's an unfair conclusion, and the jury is entitled to have the alternative explanation for it, because the defense has made that assertion, an unfair assertion that's jumped to a conclusion. And but for the defense doing that, we wouldn't have a need to inform the jury of an alternate explanation or to illuminate as to how the defense has jumped to a conclusion in making that assertion about George Floyd's behavior.
Well, here's where you're talking about rebutting the defense. When we're talking about your case in chief, how can you rebut something? I don't care if they said it in motion hearings. The jury doesn't know any of this. It's about what the evidence is, and you can't rebut prospective evidence. And it seems to me that it's either both come in or neither come in.
Well, if Your Honor, in the line of cases that deal with the admission of psychological condition evidence, the right of the prosecution or party to introduce that evidence can be itself triggered by statements made even in the opening statement, such that the prosecution doesn't have to wait if it's already been put into the case in an opening statement. It's in the nature of rebuttal testimony, but it doesn't have to wait to a rebutting if it's already been put into the case and the jury's already heard it. And so if they hear, for example, Mr. Nelson stand up and say, here you can see George Floyd is resisting arrest in his opening statement. And so he's gone and made that assertion. When we're putting our case in chief, we can say you heard them say this. That is jumping to a conclusion. There is an alternative explanation for that that relates to how one behaves when they have a panic or an anxiety attack from a traumatic event such as George Floyd encountered. Not diagnosing George Floyd, any human being who went through such a traumatic event.
All right, Mr. Nelson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, I think the court hits the nail kind of square on the head. I mean, this is a criminal trial, right? Parties are permitted to introduce evidence, draw in closing arguments, that's my job as a lawyer, is to draw inferences from that evidence. What do witnesses say? What's happening in videos? All of this. This is the very nature. And both sides are allowed to introduce information that rebuts that. I think the court is 100% correct. They either both come in or neither come in the context of the emotional state of Mr. Floyd, right? If the defense takes the perspective that what Mr. Floyd is doing, and I'm just going to ask if we can silence computers because it's really distracting. Someone's computer keeps dinging.
Please, everyone. Thank you.
In the context of the evidence of this case, right? The jury will see videotape, they'll see body camera footage, they're going to hear from witnesses who describe what they see and observe and hear and things of that nature. This is the entire nature of the adversarial system. Here's the evidence. This is how the state interprets the evidence. This is how the defense interprets the evidence. Jury, you decide which interpretation is correct. But what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? If the state is going to say, if I'm making the inference that Mr. Floyd was resisting arrest in the course, or he was exaggerating his condition, or he was actually experiencing a medical condition that went unrecognized by police officers, the state can theoretically bring in evidence to say here's an alternative explanation for that. Again, I think it's limited in this particular context, but that then opens the door. That's the precise issue, is it opens the door to say, he's saying he's claustrophobic here, but in a prior incident that's remarkably similar, that's not an issue. He gets right into the squad car, right? So it rebuts that assumption. That's the nature of the adversarial system, and I think the court understands that. We've tried lots of cases. The court has tried, a large number of cases, and understands the inferences that can be drawn from evidence. But what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and it opens the door.
All right. I'm going to take this under advisement until tomorrow. It'll be part of the rulings on the continuance, change of venue, the May 6th, 2019 other evidence that I've already outlined, and then Dr. Vincent, and we'll go from there. So we'll do these rulings tomorrow morning. So, all right, I think, where are we on jurors?
You're ready.
All right. Let's just take a quick 10-minute stretch break. All right, good morning. Didn't see you there. All right, you are juror 86, is that correct?
86, correct.
Well, good morning, and thank you for being here. Before I turn the questioning over to the attorneys, there are a couple of things I'd like to do. First of all is to swear you in, because all your answers have to be under oath. So if you could raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm, under penalty of perjury, that you will truthfully answer all questions about your qualifications to serve as a juror?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Now, the second thing is, I am wearing a mask. Plexiglass between us, plexiglass in front of you, plexiglass in front of the lawyers, so you get a double layer there. The point being, there are sufficient precautions in place that if you would like to take off your mask to be more clearly heard, or just because for comfort's sake, feel free to do so. But it's pretty much up to you. If you want to keep it on, that's fine.
Okay.
Either way, make sure that you are close enough to the microphone that we can hear you well, and I'll try and adjust settings as well to make sure that you don't have to feel like you're bobbing back and forth.
Okay.
All right. First of all, you filled out a questionnaire. Thank you for doing that and getting it back to us. That provides a lot of good information for us to start with. But was everything true on that questionnaire?
Yes.
All right. Is there anything in reflection, because it's been a few months, that you thought, oh, I should have added this, or this wasn't right what I said, or maybe your opinions have evolved and you want to change something?
Not that I can think of right now,
Okay.
because I can't remember everything.
Right. And it usually comes up in the context where the lawyers are asking you questions.
Okay.
Because they'll point to specific questions, and they'll probably, to remind you what your answer was, read the question and the answer for you to refresh your memory. My point is that I want you to be comfortable saying something that is different from what's in the questionnaire.
Okay.
Because of the passage of time, it's actually more common than not that people do add things or change things or say that wasn't accurate. So just want you to feel comfortable doing that, okay? Now, you weren't supposed to read any articles and try and avoid media about this case, but I think it's become clear that it's been a couple months. Inadvertently, you might have been exposed to some media, a headline, maybe you're watching the news and a blurb comes up about the case and gives you a little bit of information before you can turn the channel off. Anything like that happen to you?
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay, tell me about what you recall and when, roughly time frame on when it happened.
Okay, so in my household, the news constantly on, like, morning, noon,
And I'm going to just turn your microphone up a little bit. There we go.
Yes, yeah, like I said, in my household, others watch news, morning, afternoon, in the nights, and, even though I don't actively, do it, I can always overhear, and my friends also, will send, things like that on, over social media and things like that, or conversation might struck up, even though I try to avoid it, it's kind of difficult to do so.
Right, well, because we told you, don't tell anybody you're a juror, so
Correct.
you can't exactly, stop.
Correct.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. What information do you recall from it?
The most recent one was about the settlement.
Okay, and what do you recall as far as details from either the headline or friends telling you about it?
It was the headline, and then people in my household talk about it too.
Okay.
So yeah.
What is the substance of what you recall on the settlement?
I know the amount, and my friends, like, they tell me, their thoughts about it or whatnot, but, I don't say anything, I just listen. But yeah, I've gotten feedback and know where they stand on it and stuff like that. So.
And what did your friends say about it?
That one of them said, if that's not enough, I think,
Okay.
I believe, and another said, if I can't remember clearly, if that's what it is, that's what human life costs or something like that. I don't remember, but
Okay.
yeah.
As far as that goes, how do you think it'll affect you in deciding this case? Like, did it move you, as far as a juror being impartial, do you think it moved you to one side or the other?
Yes, somewhat.
Okay, tell me about that.
I like when the incident first happened. I was constantly listening.
Okay.
To be honest, I was constantly keeping updated, and to say the least, I've analyzed, and I've been in conversation with friends and family about it, and I'm drawn to one side, to say the least, and I think that's where I still stand.
Okay. I'm just trying to find your questionnaire here, just so I can maybe go over some specifics. But which side do you feel you were drawn to originally?
Plaintiff.
Okay. So not Mr. Chauvin, but towards the state. Would you agree with that? Okay. And that was before this talk of a settlement. How did that move you? You think you may have been...
I think it's still pretty much the same. I
Okay.
would say greatly, like move like drastically, but around the same.
Okay. So you're kind of here along the spectrum towards whether you're leaning this way or leaning that way. You're
Yeah.
somewhere there. Do you think it moved the needle a little bit towards, even further towards the state and against the defendant?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Okay. And you know what? We appreciate that you're honest and not hiding anything, so it's very good that you give us all this information. Because we need a juror that can be impartial, some people are able to be that because they don't know much about the case, they didn't follow it. It's not a matter of intelligence or personality. It's just some people have seen more about the case, on the basis of that have a firmly, maybe a leaning one way or the other.
Yeah.
And further events can kind of tip them even more in that direction because other people just don't pay attention to it, so it's not a problem. So you think you probably have followed this pretty intensively as far as the news and everything?
Yes.
Okay.
Because it's constantly being, even though I try not to, it's constantly there, and it's difficult to avoid it.
Yeah, I think I've even adjusted my advice to the jurors, which is not avoid news about this case. It's like avoid the news because it's so saturated with this case.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
I tried to, but
Yeah, exactly. I know it. We know it's all inadvertent, and people are not violating the court order to avoid it because it's almost unavoidable in some ways. So, I appreciate what you've just said. I'm going to excuse you from this panel. Again, don't take any offense in that. It's not that you're not a fair and impartial person. It's just that this case and the amount of exposure you've had, especially to that settlement that you said might have pushed the needle a little bit, I'm going to excuse you from this jury. So thank you for coming down. And most of all, thank you for your question, or your answers to the questions.
no problem at all.
Okay, thank
All
you.
right. Thank you.
Okay. Juror 86 is excused for cause. Juror 87. Okay. Wondering if you could have a seat right here. Good morning. You are juror 87, is that correct? All right. I'm going to go through a few things before I turn it over to the attorneys, the first of which is to swear you in because all your answers have to be under oath. So if you could raise your right hand. You swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that you will truthfully answer all questions regarding your qualifications to serve as a juror?
I do.
Okay. All right. You're fairly soft-spoken, clearly, and we have to make sure that you're heard. We have plexiglass in front of the lawyers, plexiglass between us, and plexiglass in front of you. And I'm going to continue to wear a mask, even though I've had one shot so far. I think it's appropriate that we take all the precautions we can. But given that level of precaution, you may, if you wish, remove your mask if you think it'll allow you to speak more clearly, or if it's just comfort.
That's fine.
Okay, and if at any time you want to put your mask back on, feel free. We won't take it as an insult or anything like that. Basically, you're in control of that. All right. You filled out a questionnaire, and I appreciate that because it gives a lot of good information for us to start with. Is there anything on, well, first of all, is that questionnaire true and correct?
Yes.
All right. Any changes or additions that you want to make to the questionnaire that you can think of right now?
I can't.
Okay. It's very common that in the months since you filled out the questionnaire that you might realize on reflection that I should have added this, or I should have talked about this,
Okay.
or that was inaccurate. I need to make sure they change that. Or maybe your opinions have evolved. So
Okay.
when the attorneys are asking you questions, they'll probably be more specific and zero in on certain questions and answers, and even reading them to you and your answer to refresh your memory.
Okay.
What I want you to understand is that it's all right to say something different than what's in your questionnaire. That doesn't get you into trouble because, like I say, on reflection, certain things need to be changed. Okay?
Okay.
All right. The questionnaire also advised you not to read any articles, avoid the media about that. But again, it's been a few months. This case continues to receive media coverage. And we understand that inadvertently jurors may have been exposed to some, like a headline or a blurb on the news that they can't turn the channel off quick enough.
Mm-hmm.
Anything like that? Did you learn any more information about this case or any related cases since you filled out the questionnaire?
Only number of jurors that had been selected when I was running through my news feed
Okay.
last week.
Have you heard anything about any related litigation, civil cases, anything like that?
No.
Okay. Any settlements or anything like that? Have you heard anything about
No.
other cases? Okay.
No.
All right. Sounds like you've been able to pretty much keep yourself away from the news.
Trying to.
Okay. And that's all we can ask are your best efforts. So, all right. You know something about the case from prior media before you filled out the questionnaire, before you were summoned. And the lawyers will probably go over that a bit. And you may have even formed some opinions about things, about the people involved. And the question I have for you is, as a jury, you have to decide this case just on the evidence you hear in the courtroom, not on what you've heard outside the courtroom or on opinions you formed outside the courtroom. It has to be just focused on the evidence and to follow the law as I give it to you. Do you think you could do that?
Yes.
Okay. You were given a long list of witnesses. Did you recognize anybody on that list?
Donnie Chung.
Okay. And how do you know this person?
He's a neighbor.
Okay. And what does that person do?
I think he works for the BCA, but I can't really remember. It might be FBI, something like that.
Okay. Lives in your neighborhood?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm not sure what that person's role is. Let's assume that that person actually is a witness, because the list of potential witnesses isn't long.
Yeah.
If they do testify, can you treat that person just like any other witness? Apply
Yes.
the same standards.
Yes.
If you disagreed with their testimony and didn't find it credible, could you go back to your neighborhood and if you saw that person not have a problem dealing with them?
Yes.
Okay. All right. We estimated the trial length at 4 weeks. It sounds like you could make that work with your personal and professional life. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's a yes?
Yes.
All right. The other thing is the court reporter is taking everything down, so we have to deal with yes and no quite a bit.
Okay.
You have one very good habit, though, is you don't talk over the other person. The lawyers and I are probably the worst offenders at doing that, but you seem to not have a problem doing that. And that's very good because, again, you can't have people talking over each other because it makes for a bad record. Okay, so unless you have any questions for me, I'm going to turn you over to the attorneys. No
Can't
questions?
think of any.
Okay. And just to maybe be a little closer to the microphone, as to juror number 87, Mr. Nelson, you may inquire.
Good morning, ma'am.
Morning.
Thank you for your patience, for being here yesterday, and for returning this morning. I'd like to ask you a series of kind of general questions, get to know you a little bit better, and then move into some of your responses to the questionnaire. Would that be okay with you?
Yes.
All right. So let's assume that you and I were to meet under a much different circumstance, a party or a social event or a neighborhood gathering. What would I learn about you during that conversation?
I'm married. I have 5 kids. I stayed home and raised them all.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they're all adult children now, I
Yes.
believe, right? Wonderful. And are you from Minnesota originally?
Yes.
All right. You obviously were familiar with, before receiving this packet, you were familiar with the circumstances kind of surrounding this case. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
It was kind of hard to avoid it in the cities at that time, wasn't it?
Yes.
When you received this packet and you learned that you were a prospective juror in this case, what was your first reaction to that?
I was a little nervous about it.
Okay. And why?
Well, I knew it would be a high-profile case. I knew the city, kind of blew up after the incident happened with Mr. Floyd, and I just was afraid of what might happen being part of the trial.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. When you say you were afraid of what might happen, are you talking about your personal safety? Are you talking about the city again? What do you mean?
Both, but more that anybody being on a jury or involved with it might have a little bit of a reason to worry for their privacy and their safety.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. When you came downtown yesterday and saw the state of the government center, how did that make you feel?
I had seen it before. I knew that it had been fenced off and wired in. And mostly it just made me feel sad that we're kind of in this state.
Sure. Okay. Did it alleviate any of your concerns for your personal safety while we're in the trial?
Yes, it did. I feel like the building is very secure.
Okay. And in terms of yesterday, when the judge kind of gave the initial instructions that we're trying to protect your anonymity, not putting you on camera, not referencing you by name, things of that nature, how did that make you feel?
I felt that was reassuring.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, at some point, and again, we don't know when or under what circumstances, but your name may be released to the public as a juror if you were to sit. How do you feel about that?
That makes me nervous.
Okay. And are you concerned, I mean, you referenced kind of privacy and safety concerns.
Yeah.
If you were to sit on this jury, would you be sort of hyper-focused on those types of concerns that it would distract you from listening to the evidence, focusing on the evidence, and ultimately deliberating and potentially reaching a verdict?
I don't think so.
Okay. Would those concerns influence any decision you may make at the end of the case because you want to avoid, you think that one vote may help you avoid physical safety or keep you safer?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, I apologize. It was a
That's
very.
okay.
If you were in the deliberation room and there's 2 potential verdicts, right? Guilty or not guilty.
Right.
Would your concerns about your personal safety influence your decision about guilty or not guilty? Do you think that
No.
you would be safer if you voted one way versus the other?
Right, I understand. It wouldn't influence it.
It would not? Or?
It would not.
Okay. All right. Ultimately, you would be able to listen to the evidence, listen to the testimony, look at the exhibits, and render a decision based on the evidence as it's presented in court?
Yes.
Okay. Now, have you either, well, I mean, with 5 kids, I'm assuming at some point there were some conflict between your kids?
Yes.
And as their mother, you were called upon to resolve that conflict.
Yes.
How do you approach that from the context of conflict resolution?
Try to seek out the matter and what happened, what the facts were, and what the reactions were, and who might be right and who might be wrong.
Right. It's fair to say that there's a significant amount of conflict in this case, right?
Yeah.
There's obviously a very big conflict, which is state of Minnesota versus Derek Chauvin. And then there is potential for conflict within the jury deliberation room. There's 12 people who may have 12 vastly different interpretations of what they saw and heard during the trial, right?
Yes.
How would you envision yourself approaching that type of conflict within the jury deliberation room?
I would try to listen to what everyone is saying, try to understand their point of view, and make the best decision that I could.
Okay.
I don't typically like conflict, but
Sure.
I-
But obviously, I mean, this is a situation where conflict may abound.
Yes.
You understand?
yes.
So the question becomes, you say you don't generally like conflict. If you're in a room and you feel that, you have made your mind up one way or the other, and others disagree with you, are you the type of person who is going to abandon your position simply to avoid the conflict and gain consensus? Or are you going to kind of stand your ground and say, no, I'm standing by my conviction?
I would stand by my conviction.
Again, in your personal or professional life, have you been called upon to kind of determine whether one of 2 people is telling the truth about a situation?
Yes.
Again, with your kids, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And maybe with kids it's a little easier, but how do you approach, you're going to hear witnesses in this case, right? And you're going to have to, your job as a juror is to assess their credibility. Is this person telling me the truth about X, Y, or Z? How do you assess a person's credibility?
That's a hard question. Out of any context, just
Well, I mean, I guess let's just put it back into the context of your kids, right?
okay.
2 kids come into
Sure.
you to say to you, this is what happened. And one says X happened and the other says Y happened. And you know your kids, how do you assess that situation?
I look at the past history of my kids and generally how I know their behavior is. Try to understand the situation leading up to a conflict.
Okay. So kind of gathering more information,
Yes.
would that be fair to say?
Yes.
And what if other people saw that same incident? Would you go to other people and ask them their opinion about what happened?
Yes, I would try to get all of the information that I could and make
Okay.
the best decision after that.
Fair enough. Can you think of a situation, again, in your personal or professional life where you were 100% certain you were right and you later learned that you were wrong?
Yes.
Okay. And how do you deal with that? I mean, what's your kind of response to that?
I typically go back to the person that I wronged and explained that I was wrong. And
Okay. And do you try to apply that lesson to future behavior, or do you just kind of go, no big deal, I was wrong?
no, I always try to learn from it.
Okay. Ultimately, again, your job as a juror is to analyze this evidence, to hear the evidence, to analyze it, only the evidence that you hear in this courtroom. And at the conclusion of the case, the judge will give you the law that applies to the case. And you have to decide. You're what's called a judge of the facts. What happened, right? Let's assume you get this sheet of, this is the law, these are the instructions we have to follow. And you read the law and you go, that can't possibly be right, or I think this law should be different. I've got a reason, a personal belief that this law should be different. Can you follow the law as the judge instructs you, even if you think the judge is wrong, or you think the law should be changed?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to just follow up with some of your questions and how you responded to the questionnaire. Again, we understand that this was national and international news before you received this questionnaire, and that you've been exposed to some information. And thank you for taking the time to fill this out. But I wanted to ask you a question about, there's lots of references to like a video that was made in this case. And you watch the news or the nightly news from time to time, correct?
Yeah, pretty rarely that I watch it, but yeah.
Okay. And well, there's a video that became public, and there's actually several videos that became public. You said that you've never seen any video of the arrest of Mr. Floyd?
No,
Okay, not even little snippets or clips on the news?
no. I saw a picture,
Okay,
but I did not watch the video.
okay. So when you've watched the news, you may have seen like a still frame photograph that appears to be taken from a video, kind of a thing?
Yes,
Okay. But never went and sought out or looked up this video of this arrest?
no,
Okay. But you have had conversations with friends and family members. Have your friends or family members described to you what they saw in this video?
no, not really describing it, just, no, actually not describing it.
Okay. But just maybe generally talking about it, right?
Saying that they'd seen it, and kind of the general news story that he was arrested and held on the ground and had a knee on him.
Okay.
Yeah.
You had heard in your explanation, you had heard some information about past incidents involving Mr. Floyd as well?
Yes,
All right. And you understand that Mr. Floyd's not on trial here, right?
I do.
Okay. And ultimately, you may or may not hear about previous involvement or previous incidents involving Mr. Floyd or Mr. Chauvin, right? But let's assume you don't hear any of that. Can you set what you may have learned aside and, again, assess this case based on the evidence presented in court?
Yes,
Okay. And you had heard about two separate autopsies that you thought were performed. You wrote that you heard one coroner's report said Mr. Floyd died as a result of asphyxiation. Another said it was due to drugs in his system.
yes,
Okay. And again, you'll listen to various testimony throughout the course of the case, and if those issues never come up in this case, can you set aside what you thought you had heard or read and judge the case based on the evidence as it's presented in court?
yes,
You were asked some general impressions about both Mr. Chauvin as well as Mr. Floyd. With respect to Mr. Chauvin, you had a neutral opinion, and you wrote, I haven't heard or read or seen much of anything about the defendant. And with respect to Mr. Floyd, you checked both neutral and somewhat negative, and then wrote, somewhere in between these, and you wrote, I am bothered by the fact that Mr. Floyd, and then you reference a prior incident or allegation involving him. But you also understood that he had served some sort of penalty or something like that. So,
Yes.
okay. Again, it's okay. Everybody forms their own opinions, right? And your opinions are as valid as mine or anyone else's. Can you set aside any opinions you may have formed about Mr. Floyd? And again, only analyze this case based on the evidence as presented in court.
Yes.
You were asked a question. The question reads, do you believe your community has been negatively or positively affected by any of the protests that have taken place in the Twin Cities area since George Floyd's death? And you wrote, I believe it has been negatively damaged.
Yes.
Can you explain why you think that?
Well, obviously the physical damage to the city, and seems like there's more crime than there was before. The reputation of the city seems to have taken a hit.
Okay. And can you see any positive things that have come out of the protests?
I can't say that I'm aware of any positive things that have come out of it.
Okay.
It seems pretty negative right now.
Sure. Certainly the sort of the mood of the city has changed, right?
Yes.
One of your sons went to one of the protests, though, right?
Yes.
Okay. Did you have a conversation with him about why he did that? You know.
Yes.
Okay. Do you agree there's a difference between a protest and a riot?
Yes.
Okay. Fairly self-explanatory, right?
Yes.
So the protests versus the riots, right? I think everyone would agree the riots had left a bad feeling.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the protests, the peaceful protests?
What's the question?
Well, I mean, is there anything positive that
Oh.
comes from peaceful protests?
I think there can be, sure.
Okay. Do you associate the rioting with the protests?
To some extent, I do.
Okay. Do you think that everyone who protested rioted?
No, I don't.
Okay. Did your son riot?
No, he did not.
He protested, right?
He did.
And so if you were a juror on this case, I mean, obviously your son may have a different perspective, like on the protest part of this, at least. I don't know you, I don't know your son, and I don't know what you've talked about. But if you were a juror in this case, and you ultimately rendered a not guilty verdict, could you go to your son and explain why you did that?
I could.
Okay. Would your vote be influenced because you didn't want to disappoint your son?
No.
You've had your car broken into and your son's car was stolen in the past,
Yes.
and you had to call the police.
Yes.
You indicated that you were satisfied with their response,
Yes.
or very satisfied, I should say.
Yes.
So it's fair to say you have a pretty strong respect for law enforcement and things of that nature.
I do.
Okay. And obviously this case involves a whole lot of police, right?
Yes.
Mr. Chauvin being a police officer, police officers investigating this case, police officers will testify in this case. You were asked a question, and I'm going to circle back into all of that. You were asked a question that because law enforcement officers have such dangerous jobs, it is not right to second guess decisions they make while on duty, and you somewhat disagreed and then drew an arrow towards strongly disagree with that. So knowing that the police are going to testify in this case, and presumably against Mr. Chauvin, as well as Mr. Chauvin being a former police officer, can you evaluate the testimony of police officers for what it is? Meaning, would you assign more trustworthiness to a police officer simply by virtue of the fact that they're a police officer?
No.
Okay. But you somewhat disagree with the proposition of questioning decisions that police officers make, right?
Yes.
So are there circumstances wherein a police officer's decision-making is within bounds and should be questioned?
It shouldn't be.
Should.
Should. I think that there's always room for questioning someone's reactions or behaviors. But there should probably be a process that
Okay.
that goes through.
So like a more from an employment context or like a civilian process as opposed to a criminal process?
Could you read the
Sure.
question again to me?
There was a page where you were asked to, you were given several blanket statements.
Yes.
And you were asked to just say, I strongly agree, I sort of agree, all the way over to strongly disagree. And this statement is, because law enforcement officers have such dangerous jobs, it is not right to second guess the decisions they make on duty. And you somewhat disagreed to almost strongly disagreed with that.
Okay.
Okay. So I guess the question is, are there circumstances under which it is appropriate to second guess police officers?
Yes.
All right. And there are, you recognize that there's a spectrum of decisions that a police officer makes on a daily basis, right?
Yes.
And sometimes those decisions are calculated and thought out and take some time, and other times they're very fast, right?
Yes.
So let's assume that a police officer only pulled over black drivers. Do you think it would be okay to question why that police officer is making that decision?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's assume that a police officer was stealing drugs from the evidence room. Is it okay to question that officer's decision?
Yes.
Let's assume that a police officer is chasing a person down a dark alley. It's dark, can't see, and suddenly that person turns and faces the police officer and points something at him. Is it okay at that, and the officer shoots and kills that person? Should that be also examined, that officer's decision?
I think it should be examined. I think that it probably already is examined.
Okay, fair enough. And you would agree, you strongly agreed with the statement that police in your community make you feel safe,
Yes.
right? So again, I mean, it's fine to have a healthy respect for police officers, but would you just believe police officers simply by virtue of the fact that they're a police officer?
No.
You were asked a series of questions about both Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter, and you had a very unfavorable opinion of Black Lives Matter, and you wrote, I do not agree with the guiding principles of the BLM movement. I do believe that the lives of people who happen to be black matter. So can you explain, like, what do you mean by the guiding principles of the organization?
Well, that question in particular, I mean, if that question is asking me, do I agree with the statement that Black Lives Matter? I believe that that's a true statement. I don't share I don't agree with the founding principles and a lot of the positions that the organization Black Lives Matter holds to.
Okay. So, because obviously there are kind of different layers of the statement Black Lives Matter, right?
Yes.
And there is the general sentiment, Black Lives Matter, if I'm understanding this.
Mm-hmm.
There is the movement of Black Lives Matter, and then there's an organization of Black Lives Matter.
Okay.
And are you suggesting that you disagree with the organization but are in agreement with basically the movement and notion that Black Lives Matter?
I agree with the notion that Black Lives Matter. I don't know how to parse out the difference between the movement and the organization.
Okay, fair enough. With respect to Blue Lives Matter, you had a neutral opinion, and you wrote, I don't know anything about that organization, but like my answer above, I believe that the lives of people who are police officers matter.
Correct.
So it's kind of the general sentiment that everybody matters.
Yes.
Okay. You have a relative who was a sheriff in the past?
Yes.
Some time ago?
Yes.
Is that person still alive and with us?
Yes.
Okay. So if you were a juror on this case, would you call your relative and say, hey, this is what they're telling me about how police officers are trained or what you're supposed to do. Can you confirm? Would you call that person for advice?
No.
Similarly, you have some friends who are in the medical profession in varying degrees. Would you call them for medical advice if you were a juror?
No.
I was interested in you were asked a series of questions and about the criminal justice system generally, and I was interested in one of your responses. You were asked, do you believe our criminal justice system works? Why or why not? And you wrote, I am not certain I understand this question properly, but I believe we have a system that, when it works correctly, is a fair and just system. I do understand that there could be instances when defendants do not receive adequate representation or sentencing guidelines may not be considered just. No system is perfect. I do think, in the main, that our justice system works. So the notion that when it doesn't work is because of an inadequacy of representation for individuals accused of crimes, is that where you think is a problem in the system?
I think that's one problem in the system.
Right. A reason to fully fund, say, the public defender's office, right?
Maybe.
Maybe. And then also just in terms of the disparity in sentencing, is that what you mean by the sentencing guidelines may not be considered just?
Yes.
Ultimately, you understand that I'm a lawyer, I represent my client, these are lawyers, they represent their client, and we're all trying to do the best we can do, right?
Yes.
Now, you were asked a question, the last question you were asked is, do you want to serve as a juror on this case? And you checked the box, not sure, right? And you wrote, this trial, like the events that led to it, will be well publicized and followed by many people. The unrest, burning, and looting following Mr. Floyd's death was troubling. It would be naive to think that similar things couldn't happen depending on the outcome of the trial. I am not sure if it is warranted, but I could have concerns about my privacy and safety. So that's
Yes.
that same notion that we started up our conversation with, right?
Yes.
Knowing what you know now, a couple months later, do you feel that you would be a fair and impartial juror in this case?
Yes.
Could you set aside your concerns about privacy and safety and listen to the evidence and judge this case based on the evidence?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I have a moment? We'll pass for cause, Your Honor.
Mr. Slusher. Thank you, Your Honor. Juror number 87, good morning. I know you've been at it for a while and have been patient, and we thank you for that. I do want to follow up on a couple of your responses. And in one instance, I believe you responded on the survey that you believe somewhat agree with the proposition that discrimination is not as bad as the media says that it is. Do you recall that response?
I don't, but
Does that sound consistent with your belief that you somewhat agree that the media maybe overblows discrimination or exaggerates it?
yes.
Okay. So the two parts of that. First, what do you believe the media says about discrimination?
Well, by saying that I feel like they exaggerate it, I feel like the media exaggerates a lot of things. So I don't know that it would be necessarily more than other things that they exaggerate, but I feel like they may push it to a degree that stirs up controversy.
Okay.
And is that what you're looking for as an answer?
I'm just looking for your answer.
Well, I know,
Yeah.
I meant to, did it answer your question?
It did. It did. But of course, now I'll have to follow up. But in that, why do you think the media does that?
I think they're not as unbiased as they always claim that they are. I guess that would be my answer.
Okay. And are there particular stories or instances that you can think of that you thought, the media is really kind of overplaying or overselling discrimination, or is it more of a generalized feeling you get from watching the news or reading the paper?
More of a generalized feeling.
Okay. Now, I'd like to compare that generalized feeling with some of your own real life experience in how you would make that determination. So have you had conversations with close friends or family members who have experienced discrimination in their life?
Have I had them?
Yes.
Just in what areas? Any area?
Any area.
I'm sure I have, but I can't think of any off the top of my head.
How about taking it from the more general to the
Okay.
specific racial discrimination? Have you had conversations with friends of yours who've talked to you about racial discrimination that they may have experienced?
Yes.
And how have those conversations, I guess, compared with what you've seen on TV or read in the paper regarding the media's depiction of discrimination?
Well, when you're speaking with one person, you're getting more of a personal story behind it. And so when you have those kinds of facts, it's a little easier to understand the discrimination than just a blanket discrimination story or something like that you might see.
So it sounds like you would be more inclined to believe a more personal story than you would just kind of a generalized story that you would see in the media.
Yes.
Can you share with us, without revealing, who this person would be, just what conversations have you had with friends who've experienced discrimination? What kind of discrimination have they shared with you?
Being looked at suspiciously, being categorized in certain ways. being treated as somehow less than other people.
It's hard to hear those experiences, isn't it?
It is.
You indicated in your survey that the criminal justice system, in response to the question whether the criminal justice system is biased against racial and ethnic minorities, you indicated that you somewhat disagree with that proposition. And I'd like you to share with us a little bit, why you somewhat disagree with that proposition.
Well, I think when I answered that question, I was looking at it as how the system should work, and that we have a legal system that should work fairly for everyone. So I don't believe the system has been written in to be discriminatory.
As opposed to maybe in practice how it can work out for some people. So think of your friend who shared with you the view that from your friend's perception, they were put in a certain category or viewed suspiciously that maybe someone else in the same situation would not have been.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that can bleed into the criminal justice system? After all, we are all human beings here.
Sure. Yes.
So would you then agree that the criminal justice system can be biased against racial and ethnic minorities?
I believe it could be in instances, sure. I don't know that I would agree that it is as a blanket statement, but yes.
You indicated that you and a bit of a rarity have not seen the video that we were talking about earlier, but you did recall seeing an image from the video. Is that right?
I'm assuming it's from the video. It was just a still picture, and I think I saw it on a news website.
Do you recall what that still picture showed?
It showed police officer. I don't think I saw Mr. Floyd. I believe there was maybe a car on the edge of the picture. And that's all I can remember seeing.
Okay. You indicated that you had an uncle who worked for about 2 decades in a fairly large department. We won't identify which one it was. Is that right? As a deputy sheriff?
Yes, yes.
Are you close with your uncle?
Not super close.
Did you ever speak with your uncle about his line of work?
I'm sure I did over the years, yeah.
Has he ever shared stories with you about, just work-related stories?
Uh-huh, yes.
Can you recall any particular instances? Usually when an officer will share a story with somebody, it won't be about the time nothing happened, right?
Right. He served papers. So he'd shared a couple stories with me where people did not react well to being served papers. And one story of being, I believe he was bit in the jail by somebody in jail. But that's really all I can remember him talking about.
Sounds like a pretty difficult job in one's line of work. You don't expect to get bitten by people.
Sure.
Right? And you also indicated that you do have a strong trust in police officers. Is that right?
Yes.
And you did state in response to counsel's question that you believe that you could evaluate the testimony of a police officer in the same light as a non-police officer.
Yes.
But I need to ask you, if you were, say, walking down the street and you were looking for a particular place, say the IDS Center, you didn't know where it was, and there were two people. One was a police officer and one was a bystander. And the police officer told you that the IDS Center was to the left, and the bystander told you that the IDS Center was actually to the right. Which direction would you follow?
Probably the police officer's direction. I would assume if he worked for the city, he would know.
And why is that? Why do you think you would follow the police officer's direction?
Because I guess I would assume that he would have had that question before, that he would have directed people in the city before.
And so based on that experience, you believe that the officer would be reliable, at least in terms of directions?
Yes.
Right. As opposed to the bystander, what would you question about the bystander's directions?
If I know nothing other than he's a bystander, I don't know that they're from the city. I don't know their background. I wouldn't assume that they knew more than the police officer knew.
I wanted to follow up with you. You indicated that your son did go to a protest.
Yes.
Did you talk to your son about going to the protest?
After, when I found out that he had gone.
This wasn't something he shared with you before?
No.
So, Mom, I'm going to a protest.
No, he did not.
Okay, what was your reaction when you found out that your son went to this protest, hadn't told you about it, found out after the fact?
He was on the 35W bridge when the truck came through. So my reaction was that I was very frightened when he called and told me that.
Okay. I recall that story. What did he tell you about it?
He just told me he was on the bridge, that the truck came, that everybody ran. So.
Were you upset with him for attending the protest in the first place? Was it more that you were upset finding out, I would imagine, about the truck incident on the 35?
I was upset about the truck incident. I wasn't angry with him for going. I was more concerned for his safety.
Okay. One moment, Your Honor. Thank you very much, and thank you, ma'am, for your answers. Your Honor, the state will exercise a preemptory.
And Juror 87, you are excused from this panel, and so you won't have to serve on the jury. And in fact, you're excused from all jury service for now, unless we send you a summons in the future. You don't have to worry about being called about a different case during this term. Okay. So the deputy will escort you out and take some paperwork from you, and okay, we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I've lost track. What number was that for the state?
87.
I'm sorry, it was what number strike?
It was his sixth strike.
Okay. So you have 4 left. Got it. Before we bring the next, is the next juror coming? Okay.
Do not want
Yeah, can you hold on? Just hold them in the hallway. I just want council to be aware of something. Okay. Just so that council is aware, a variety of members of the media have been asking for more information about jurors or when it's going to be public, pressing us for a little more detail. And I've been emailing with the chief judge about that, and it's being communicated to the media, so I think you should be aware of what's being communicated to the media and even incorporate it in your voir dire if you wish. And that specifically is that nothing is going, we are currently releasing the race and the age decade of seated jurors. Everything else, because we have an anonymous jury, is remaining confidential. It is not being released publicly. When it will be released publicly is up to the court, and I have told Judge Barnett that I will order the release of the questionnaires and identifying information, a name, not an address, perhaps a single contact method, email, text, whatever, when I deem it safe to do so. That will be based mostly, as you all know, judges are very protective of our jurors. When I feel it is safe for the jurors, I will release their information, not before. And so if you want to incorporate that, that it's basically the court's decision to when to release such information, and the court will do so when it determines that it is safe to do so. So, because I know, Mr. Nelson, you've kind of tried to bring it up without saying what the court's going to do. I think if you can repeat that to the jurors, so, and of course that doesn't give anybody a date certain. It's my evaluation of the current situation, and at the time when a release is requested or on my own motion, it will be released when I deem it safe to do so. So, you may voir dire on that issue as well, using the court standard that has now been communicated to the media. All right, let's bring our next juror in, which is juror number 88. Good morning. If you could come right up here to this chair right next to me.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for your patience and waiting as well.
Of course.
And in fact, you were the last one from, I believe, yesterday's group.
That is correct.
So we made you come back.
Yeah.
All right. Before I turn it over to the attorneys, I'm going to take care of a few matters, ask you a few questions. First of all, I'm going to swear you in so that all your answers are under oath. If you could raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm, under penalty of perjury, that you'll truthfully answer all questions about your qualifications to serve as a juror?
I do.
All right, thank you. We have plexiglass between us, plexiglass in front of you. The lawyers also have plexiglass in front of them. And I am going to continue to wear a mask, even though I've had one of the shots. My point being, because of the level of protection we have, you may remove your mask when you're being examined, if it's more comfortable for you, or if you think you need to do so to speak clearly. But that's pretty much I'm leaving to you. And even if you take it off at some point, if you feel you want to put it back on, that's also okay. All right?
Okay.
Okay. First of all, you filled out a questionnaire, and thank you for doing that and getting it back to us. It gives us a lot of information to start with. Was everything true on the questionnaire?
Yes.
All right. Any changes or additions that you can think of at this point?
No.
Okay. We have found it's very common that because of the delay between when you filled it out and now, several months, that you on reflection may think, oh, I should have put this in, I should probably add that, or even that was not accurate, or I have an opinion and it's evolved. It's different than it was when I filled out the questionnaire. Both honest opinions, but just it's changed. My point is, you should feel comfortable in giving an answer that is different from the questionnaire. So feel free to do that. What we're looking for is, honest, candid answers. The lawyers are probably going to be directing your attention to specific questions, and they'll even read the question and your answer. Not to be disrespectful, and don't take it as confrontational. It's more to refresh your memory as to what your answer was.
Sure, I appreciate that.
And when you hear those questions, again, you might say, "Oh, it has changed. I do need to add something." That's perfectly understandable. All right, now the questionnaire also advised you not to read any newspaper articles, online articles, media advisory, or any media about this case. Basically, stay away from the news about this case. But, again, we understand it's been a few months since the questionnaire. You inadvertently may have been exposed to some information about this case or related cases or the parties, anything like that. Maybe see a headline that has some substance in it, or see a news report and you can't turn the channel quick enough. Has that happened to you? Have you been exposed to anything since the questionnaire till today?
I have.
Okay, tell me what you recall seeing.
While at home, I've seen things on the television, and it's just easier and quicker for me to get up and leave the room, and then my husband will either change the channel or mute it.
Okay.
But I heard something about a payout from the city.
And did you hear any specifics about the amount or anything like that?
I don't recall the amount, but I remember hearing millions.
Okay. When you filled out the questionnaire and submitted it, did you think at that time you could be a fair and impartial juror?
Yes.
Did that news that you found out about, did that move you off that position, that maybe you can no longer be impartial, or it doesn't have any effect on my partiality? I could be the same fair and impartial juror as before.
Yes, I think I can be.
Okay. Do you think what effect do you think that hearing about that settlement will have on you?
Well, my initial reaction, of course, was shock, surprise.
Mm-hmm.
But then I just, kind of said to myself, well, I didn't hear all of it, so I don't know all of it.
Okay.
And then I just kind of brushed it away.
Okay. That's a good analogy.
Mm.
Any other information you found out about this case? And we know it's all inadvertent because you can't avoid news about this to some
Right.
degree.
I do recall hearing something about some jurors, like about maybe last week, that they were up to maybe 4 jurors.
Okay.
But that's really about it.
Okay, so just the progress we're making here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The important thing to do here is not to say, I haven't read anything, I don't know anything about this case. I don't think there's anybody who knows nothing about this case.
Right.
There are varying degrees of knowledge. Some people have seen a lot, heard a lot, read a lot. Others have seen something but don't recall exactly. And the question is whether you've seen a lot or a little. Can you put all that aside and decide this case just on the evidence that you hear in the courtroom?
Yes, I believe so.
In fact, for example, getting back to that settlement, that's not going to be a part of this case because it was a different lawsuit, different parties, different laws, different issues.
Civil.
Yeah. That's an example of something you heard about, but you have to put aside because it's not going to be in this courtroom. Do you understand that?
I do.
Okay. Do you think you could do that as far as all you've heard about this case? Kind of put aside what you may have heard outside the courtroom, sweep it away, brush it away, and just focus on the evidence and follow the law that I give to you?
Yes.
And as you sit here right now, do you think you are an impartial juror?
Yes.
Okay, great. Did you recognize any witnesses that were on the witness list?
Yes.
Okay. What type of work do they do? Let's start with that.
I have no idea.
Okay. Is it just one person?
Yes.
Are they in law enforcement?
No.
Okay. Is this a neighbor, acquaintance?
An acquaintance.
Okay. do you think if that person were to testify, that you would treat them the same as any other witness who comes before us?
Of course.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to order that we go off the audio. As you know, the audio is being broadcast. But I'd like to ask you a question that might be more specific and might identify yourself. So I don't want to do that.
Okay, great, thank you.
So I think what I'm going to do is order that under the rules that this would involve specific information that might identify the jurors, and so we'll go off audio at this time. All right, we are back on audio after a discussion with the juror. They have been excused by the court for cause. Reminder to the press that there's no reporting of the substance of an off-the-record or rather off-audio discussion. It is, in essence, an in-camera examination. So with that, let's take a 20-minute break. Let's come back at 10 minutes to 11. Thank you.